used to build a fully 21st century presidential campaign. She is an author of a critically acclaimed book, Lean Impact, How to Innovate for Radically Greater Social Good. Previously, she has served at USAID, at Mercy Corps, and at secretaries as an advisor for women and technology in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the US State Department. Prior to her public and social sector, she was a senior technology executive at Google, Apple, and Intuit, and as well as a range of other startups. And Mei currently serves at the boards of BRAC, USA, and IREX, and is a non-resident fellow at Brookings Institution and at the Center for Global Development. Please help me welcoming Mei Chang.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. How are you guys all today?
Good. Awesome.
Are you all full? Did you have a good lunch?
Yeah.
Good. I apologize. I'm going to be standing here at the podium just because, did we find a clicker? Great. Maybe we'll just stick this in before we get started so it'll be less disruptive. Let's see if this works. Okay, I'm just going to stand here then. Thank you again so much for having me today. Today, what I want to talk about is social innovation. And before we dive in, I want to set a little bit of context, just very quickly. When I look around the world, we're living in a world where we're seeing unprecedented interconnectedness and an incredibly speeding up pace of change around the world. We're seeing advancements in things like AI and automation changing the very nature of what work is. We're seeing more and more of the traditional development challenges and poverty concentrating in fragile states. We're also seeing climate change completely disrupt a lot of countries. That's causing both more natural disasters and economic disruption. The nature of development is also changing in that sources of funding are changing, where it used to be that foreign aid represented a significant portion of how development was done, and today the private sector represents 10 times as much, and local governments are representing 3 times more even than that. And on top of that, the rise of nationalism has really caused countries to pull back. Countries who were really looking to invest in development are more now looking towards their own interests. And so I share all these trends to say that there's a lot of uncertainty going on. And also, when we look at what we're trying to do, things like really trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Is everyone familiar with Sustainable Development Goals? Great. So as a world, we adopted these Sustainable Development Goals only about 3.5 years ago now, and yet already we know that we are behind, that we're not on a trajectory to meet many of these. And so when you take all these trends in aggregate, what it leads me to believe is that we're living in a world of extreme uncertainty. Uncertainty both because the world around us is changing, and uncertainty because our solutions just aren't sufficient for the goals that we have for the world. And how many of you have heard of the Lean Startup? Wow, a lot of you, that's great. So Eric Ries, when he wrote the Lean Startup, he talks about Lean Startup as a methodology to build products and services under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And I think we are living in this condition of extreme uncertainty. And one of the things that I recognized in coming into this field is that despite all the enormous efforts that amazing people like all of you are doing, you're working incredibly hard on incredibly difficult challenges, we just don't seem to, in aggregate, be making enough of a dent, right? That we're just not on track to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And why is that? I would argue that a big reason for that is because we're simply bringing the wrong tools to the table. If you think about it, where we have solutions that we know we have confidence are going to work and work well enough and are going to reach enough people, then it makes absolute sense for us to focus on delivery and execution on those solutions. But for the vast majority of sort of problems that are out there, they're big, complex, entrenched, that don't have an easy solution, and certainly don't have clear solutions that we've already identified. And in those situations, we need to take a different approach. One that emphasizes, instead of delivery, emphasizes the speed of learning. And that's where tools like Lean Startup can come in, to really look at how do we learn faster so that we can get to better solutions that will really solve the challenges in front of us. And because of this, there's been a lot of excitement and a lot of interest in this whole idea of innovation. Innovation for social good, innovation for development. I think it's important to keep in mind this quote from Edison, I think, sums it up really nicely, and I think I would apply it to innovation equally so. That innovation is 1% inspiration, 1% the big idea, the invention, that new solution. But 99%, and the main focus of innovation, is the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into taking that germ of a great idea and testing, iterating, failing, picking yourself back up again, and going over and over again to refine that solution, make it better and better over time so that it has the impact that we need and can reach the scale that we need. And so, over the last couple of years, I have been, in writing this book, I've been lucky enough to get to interview over 200 different organizations. I sought out the best of the best, organizations domestic and international, nonprofits and for-profits, across all different sectors, and I asked them, what were the secrets to your success? And I distilled down 3 core principles. Think big, start small, and relentlessly seek impact. Now, these may sound obvious and they may sound simple, but all too often what I found is that most organizations do exactly the opposite. They think too small, they start too big, and they lose sight on their path to impact. So today I want to talk about all 3 of these. Let's start with think big. When I come from Silicon Valley, I spent over 20 years in Silicon Valley, and in Silicon Valley, every startup company carries around their PowerPoint deck with their hockey stick graph of how they're going to reach 1 billion people or make $1 billion, and they have these grand ambitions. Now, when I come to the social sector, we may recognize a huge need, but what I found is that most of us plan based on constraints. We look at, hey, here's how many dollars we have. Here's how many people we have. Here's this grant opportunity that's this size and scope. And then we look at these constraints and these limited resources and we say, what can we do within these constraints? And usually we can do some good. Certainly we can do some good. But rarely is it enough to really move the needle on the problems that exist in the world. And so I'll put this into some more concrete context. Over the last 30 years, we've made slow but steady progress on traditional development interventions, things like expanding access to clean water, electricity, sanitation. And we think, okay, we're gradually getting there, we're making some progress and so forth, right? But during the same period of time, adoption of mobile phones has skyrocketed, where today more people have a mobile phone than a toilet. And why is that? I think there's a couple things that really stand out to me. One is that mobile phones are something that people really, really want. And they don't only want, they demand it. I hear so many stories about how people will top up their mobile phones before they'll buy food, because it's so important to them to stay connected with loved ones, to access economic opportunities and so forth. There's also a business model behind it. The companies that sell mobile phones, telecom companies that sell services, they are able to make money. They charge money, they make money, they're able to plow that back into improving their services and expanding their business. And so the combination of demand and a driver to expand supply has resulted in this kind of accelerated growth. And I challenge all of us to ask the question, how can we aim for something that looks more like this? Because this is what's really needed in the world. And of course, scaling is very different when it comes to the social sector. So let me give an example in kind of the world of global development. And I want to share the story of Vision Spring, which is a nonprofit. And I love Vision Spring because instead of what I think a lot of folks do when they're trying to innovate, they come up with some bright, flashy, sexy new technology. Vision Spring decided to focus on a 600-year-old invention, but one that has been proven to increase productivity and learning potential. And that's simply eyeglasses. Now, their estimates are that despite this being a 600-year-old invention, there's 2.5 billion people around the world. That's billion with a B. There's 2.5 billion people around the world who could benefit from eyeglasses and don't have them. And so they set out to solve this problem. They started, like most nonprofits would, decided to focus on 2 geographies, in their case, El Salvador and India. And they hired people they called vision entrepreneurs to provide vision care services to people who are poor and living in rural areas. And they came back with these compelling stories of kids who were able to learn for the first time, adults who were able to work again. And many nonprofits would be thrilled by this. It's like, we're making a huge difference in these people's lives. And yet they realized quickly that they were losing money with each person that they served, and they would never be able to get anywhere close to the 2.5 billion number. So their first pivot is that they decided to set up vision centers in more urban areas, serving a more affluent population, and take the profits from that to do outreach in the more rural areas. And through this, they were able to become financially self-sustainable. Now, what could be better? You're doing good and you're financially self-sustainable. Sort of the holy grail for nonprofits, right? It's just that they also realized that in order to scale their footprint, to reach all the people that need to be reached, it would take them decades, if not centuries. So they pivoted again. They decided instead of providing service directly, they would partner. And they partnered with organizations like BRAC in Bangladesh that has a network of community healthcare workers across the country, of thousands of community healthcare workers, and decided to provide vision care services through them. And so through this partnership with BRAC and other partnerships, they've now been able to provide almost 5 million pairs of eyeglasses. Now, for a lot of us, that would be impressive. 5 million pairs of eyeglasses is pretty good for a nonprofit. But if you step back and think about it, 5 million is a tiny, tiny fraction of 2.5 billion, and it still wasn't enough. So their most recent pivot is they set up something called the Eye Alliance that brought together eyeglass manufacturers, local governments, and nonprofits, and really looked at this as a systems problem, recognized this was not a problem any one organization alone was going to solve, that we needed to motivate the eyeglass manufacturers to manufacture lower cost eyeglasses and distribute them to further reaching areas, to get local governments to take care of the vision care needs of their populations. And so by bringing all these folks together and approaching it as a systems challenge, they now have a hope of doing that. And in an early success, they signed an MOU with the government of Liberia to integrate vision care services into their public school and public health systems. And you can imagine that's now looking at this as a systems challenge. They're much more now on that path to accelerating their growth to really hitting that 2.5 billion number over time. So Vision Spring's story is just one story of one path and scale. But I think what's interesting about it is that they thought big. They recognized the size of their problem was big. It was 2.5 billion people. And by keeping their eye focused on that prize, it's forced them to really take a hard look at everything they were doing each step of the way and evaluate it relative to that goal and push themselves to find ways to be able to deliver to that goal. So now once we have that big audacious goal, and we have a potential solution, the temptation is to start to execute as fast as we can. Get it out to as many people as we can. But in my experience, by starting small, we can make a much bigger impact over time. Because there's a real trade-off between the energy and cost and investment that it takes to deliver things versus the time and investment it takes to test and iterate and improve on a solution. And so when we focus too much on just delivering a solution, we can't focus as much on improving that solution. And so one of the things I noticed when I came into the social sector is that people like to plan a lot. When I was at Google, we only had plans that ever lasted only 3 months at most. But in the social sector, we can sit in conference rooms and discuss solutions and discuss theories of change for months and months and months. And by the time a solution gets out to the people who are going to benefit, it can be months or years down the road. And in the meantime, we're working in dynamic environments, and so the whole context could have changed, the existing technologies could have changed, and there's so much risk that's built up because it's hard to predict what will happen in the real world. And so when we fail big, and we waste a lot of time and money heading down the wrong path. So the essence of Lean, the idea is to figure out how do we take smaller steps? How do we learn by doing? Get our solutions out into the world sooner rather than later so that we can learn what really happens. How do people really respond? How does the ecosystem really respond to something that we believe might work? When we do this, the good news is that when we fail small. And that failure is no longer a big failure. It's simply a learning that allows us to adapt and improve on what we're doing. And so, at the core of Lean Startup, Eric defined something called the build, measure, learn feedback loop. That's essentially how we do that iteration. And this may sound like a fad or something, another kind of cycle that you could do, but this is essentially the scientific method. And I would call it an entrepreneurial version of the scientific method. So it's not something that's made up. It's really, if you have a potential solution that hasn't been tried before, that you hope will do something good, you form a hypothesis. What do you think will happen when you deploy a solution? You hope that something good will happen. But instead of hoping and just hoping for the best, let's test our hypothesis. We do so by building an experiment, something Eric calls a MVP, or minimum viable product. And that's the quickest, cheapest experiment you can possibly build that will help you learn something about your hypothesis so that we can learn as quickly as possible. Then we measure, we gather the data, we see what happened, and then we learn. If our solution succeeded with a few people, a low fidelity prototype, then we can double down and do more. If it didn't work, we can learn something and adapt, improve on what we're doing, or we might recognize we're on the wrong path altogether and pivot and take a different course. And the key here to the build, measure, learn feedback loop is I believe every single one of you does this, because we all do this. Eventually we build something, we learn, we come back. What I've seen is that when we build something in the social sector, we often try to build something that's at least like a 6-month pilot. And that's a really slow pace of learning by the time you deploy your pilot, evaluate it, and then go back and learn and do something different. So the key here is not that you don't do this, but that how do we speed up the feedback loop? How do we speed this up so that the feedback loop goes from months or years down to days or weeks? Because the faster we can learn when we're working in these conditions of uncertainty, the faster and more likely we are to get to a solution that really is going to work. So when it comes to social innovation, there are 3 pillars that I believe are essential for a successful social innovation. And what I found is most organizations, and even most organizations that try to help organizations succeed, tend to focus on 1 or 2 of these, and rarely all 3. And it's one of the biggest reasons why we don't have as more successes in the innovation space that are really being transformative. And so we need to pay attention to value, impact, and growth. So value is the first question we often want to ask, which is this something people even want? and not only do they want it, but will they demand it, come back for it, tell their for them, not just that it's something that we think is good for them. Impact is the question of, does it work? Does it not only deliver the social benefit we intend, but to the degree that's needed to really move the needle? And finally, if something that people want and it works, growth is the third question. How are we going to scale this to get to the full size of the need? And that usually means finding an engine that will accelerate growth over time. So let's give some examples of each of these, starting with value. So a lot of times when we want to test value, we go out and we do a focus group, or we ask questions, we do a survey, and we ask questions about what people think. But the reality is that what people tell us is often not a great indicator of what they actually want. And NextLeaf is an organization that really saw this. They were working in, NextLeaf is a organization that provides sensors, wireless sensors, to be able to detect usage of different types of interventions. In this case, they were in rural India working on trying to figure out why only about 10% of women were using the cook stoves, the clean cook stoves that they had. And what they found is they installed sensors in these cook stoves to see how they were being used. And what they found is that the reported usage by the women had no correlation with how they were actually using the cook stoves. Some women would say they were using them more in different ways than they actually did. Some would say they were less, and there was just no correlation. That if you just ask people to report what they're doing, you're not going to get very good data. And of course, just getting data from the sensors is efficient, but by getting data from the sensors, they were able to really understand what was going on and help them refine the right questions to ask to get at what was happening. And through this, they were able to identify some usability challenges and so forth that allowed them to improve on the cook stoves and get usage back up to almost 100%. And so what does an MVP in the social sector look like? It's certainly a lot easier to run an MVP when you're talking about building a web app or a mobile phone app than it is when you're talking about social impact that may not have any technology involved. So Copia Global is a social enterprise in Kenya. Their mission was to see how they could provide a much wider range of consumer goods to people who were rural families who were away from cities and just didn't have access to much beyond the basic staples. And so their idea was to have a catalog that people could order from and that they would be able to do delivery to those villages in the same way that Amazon might here in the US. But this was a risk. This was their hypothesis. Would people want to buy from a catalog? What kind of products would they buy? Who would be helpful in selling from this catalog? So they had a lot of questions. And instead of building out the infrastructure, the warehouses, coming with a nice app for the catalog and so forth, they decided to run an MVP. And their MVP consisted of the CEO, Crispin, going to the local Nakumat, which is the Walmart equivalent there, and taking pictures of a bunch of products on the shelves that he thought people might want and pasting them into a catalog and handing them out to a couple villages. And then he sat back to see what would happen. Now this took only a few days, right, to do this. What he found, the good news he found that people did want to order from this catalog. The orders started coming in, and when someone would order from the catalog, he himself would go run to the store, buy the product off the shelf, and hand carry it to the village. Now this is not something that would ever scale, but was something you could get going right away, very cheaply. Because if it didn't work, it would have wasted very little time and money. But the good news is that people would buy from this catalog. But he also learned a bunch of really important things about setting up this business. One is that he discovered that what kind of products people wanted to buy. What do you think the most popular product has been for Copia? Yeah?
Flour.
Flour? Yeah, that's a good guess. What other products do people think might be popular? Huh?
Sugar.
Sugar? Well, it turns out their most popular product has been cement, right? And you can imagine now why cement would be popular, because it's very heavy to get cement. And if you don't have a car and you're far off from the city, it's hard to get. And so you can also imagine that if you're running a business that's trying to deliver these heavy packages of cement, you have to build a very different infrastructure than if you're delivering flour or sugar, which was what I would have guessed also. And so by running this MVP, it gave them important information and helped them shape the nature of the business that they needed to build. They also learned another interesting thing. They originally thought that they were going to, the people who they were going to sell through were the kiosk owners, like people who were having these small stores that were selling the consumer staples. But it turned out the kiosk owners weren't very interested in selling from the catalog. They were more interested in selling the stuff that they had on inventory in their store. And what turned out to be much better salespeople for them, much better agents, were people who ran complementary businesses, like a hair salon. You know, someone comes to visit the hair salon, they're waiting their turn, they can flip through the catalog, order something, it doesn't cannibalize their business, but it gives them an additional income stream. And so all of these things they learned really helped shape how they then built out the next stage of their business, and saved them a lot of money from heading down the wrong path that they would have had to restart again. So the second pillar of social innovation is impact. You know, the question again, does it work? And impact, you know, is a lot harder to measure than in the private sector where what we care about is measuring profits. And a lot of times because of that, we get lazy. So Harambee Youth Accelerator is a nonprofit in South Africa. They are focused on helping addressing the huge scourge of youth unemployment in South Africa, which is at epidemic proportions, where something like 40% of youth are not in employment, education, or training. A lot of the organizations I know of that try to address the youth unemployment issues, because there's a lot of organizations out there, what they focus on is they count how many youth did I train? Or maybe, if they're good, they count how many youth did I help get jobs? Harambee took it a step further, because what they recognize is not enough to train a youth. It's not enough to get a youth a job. What really matters is having them get a job and stay in the job. Because studies show that once somebody stays in a job for at least a year and is able to have that continuous employment and the experience, they are likely to be able to be employed through their life. And so they really focused on this, as that's what matters for impact. And so what they do is they measure things every step of the way, starting from the assessments when the first youth first come in the door to see what their skills are and what their potential is, to when they're going through the training to see are they learning, are they being successful, what are the best jobs that they would be good for. And then when they get placed into jobs, they go back and measure to see are they being retained in these jobs. They send text messages, they get data back. And from this, they learned some really interesting things. For example, when they first got started, they were placing a lot of youth at retail stores where they would be like checkout clerks, you know, kind of checking people out. And they saw that a lot of youth were not staying very long in these jobs. After a few weeks, they would drop out. And so, because they gathered this data, they went back to find out why. Why were the youth dropping out from these jobs? And it turned out that the youth simply weren't accustomed to standing all day. It wasn't something they had done in their lives. It was just not something they were comfortable with. They were fed up by it, and so they left. And so what did Harambee do with this learning? They went back and they decided to iterate and improve on their solution. Their iteration for this particular problem is they decided to run their training program with the youth standing up, so that they would get used to the idea of standing up, get comfortable with the idea, so it was no longer a shock when they got into their job and found that that's what they were expected to do. And so that's a very simple, small tweak, but it made a huge difference in terms of the retention rate of these youth and getting them on the right path to success. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we spent a lot of time often coming up with our theory of change. If you don't have a theory of change, you should. Do you guys all know what a theory of change is? Yeah, okay, great. So we all spent a lot of time coming up with our theory of change. Again, we spent a lot of time discussing them and debating them in conference rooms, and then usually we put them on the bookshelf. Like, we come up with a theory of change, let's put it on the bookshelf. Well, if we care about impact, what we need to do is test our theory of change. And that means testing the linkages to see whether it is in fact happening. In the simple example, if what you're trying to do is reduce the incidence of malaria by giving out mosquito nets, it may take years before you try to use it. Okay. It may take.
John?
Is this on? I don't think it's on.
Ken,
What?
you told me to get the other mic.
So it may take years before you can really fully measure
have to
whether the
replace the
incidence of
pen.
malaria has been reduced in a particular region. But tomorrow, you could go and you could tell whether people have hung up their mosquito nets, whether they're sleeping under the mosquito nets. And if they're not, there's no point in waiting years to see whether or not the incidence of malaria has gone down, because if it did, it wasn't due to what you did. And so testing your theory of change is essentially testing those early linkages, and not only seeing if they're happening to some extent, but seeing if you can optimize them. Because if, say, 60% of people are hanging out the mosquito nets, if I can get up to 90%, that'll make a big difference. And I can try things like running a training to show people how to hang them up properly, or giving them instruction manuals, or even going and hanging it up for them. And so it's really important for us to both have a theory of change and test the theory of change in these lightweight ways that help us be more and more certain over time that we're going to result in the impact that we're looking for. So the third pillar of social innovation is scale, which is really the question of growth. And I talked about the Silicon Valley startups who carry these hockey stick graphs that look something like this, right? They're talking about exponential growth. What's interesting about a hockey stick graph is, if you notice in the very beginning, it's pretty flat. You're not reaching very many people, because what you're doing there is you're testing and iterating and improving on your solution. And what you're trying to do is find that inflection point, that point where you bend the curve and growth starts to accelerate because there is some driver that's going to accelerate your growth over time. And instead, what I often see in the social sector is something that looks more like this, a logarithmic graph. And with a logarithmic graph, what happens is, like, we come up with an idea, it's really exciting, we get some donor excited about the beginning, and we are out off to the races, and we get out to a lot of people, make a big splash. But if you come back to a lot of those things that were in the news like 5 years ago, most of them have stagnated. Right? Most of them are, maybe they're still going at a modest size, but very few of them have taken off. Because what happened is they got on this logarithmic curve, that they became dependent on donors. And so over time, one of two things happen. Either you just reach the natural limits of donor dollars, because there's only so much. It's only a tiny sliver of the dollars that are available to address issues. And so if you're dependent on donors, at some point you run out of enough donor money to be able to scale anymore. Or donors are fickle. They move on. They go on to the next flashy new thing. And then you're left, kind of struggling. And so what we want to do is figure out how we get on that exponential curve. And there's kind of three primary ways to get to scale. And there's variations on all these. The first, and of course the easiest, is if you can have some sort of business model, right, where you're getting some money in for what you're selling, whether it's a product or service. And there's variations on this, right? You could do a cross-subsidy model, like Vision Spring did. You can have a donation model, like crowdfunding model, something. But at the end of the day, you're getting dollars in for everything that you send out. Off-grid electric is a great example of this. If you've heard of all the various different companies who provide home solar systems using mobile money to allow people to pay as they go to be able to pay off their solar systems, because they've come up with this kind of business model that allows them to find a way for their customers who are low income be able to pay for their product over time. They're able to have a business model, and they and other companies are really scaling rapidly now, some of the biggest successes in the social enterprise space, because there's this business model behind it. But of course, for many of the things that we care about, a business model is just not viable. It's not something that people are able to pay for, willing to pay for. And this is true especially when it comes to basic social services. And in those cases, government is really the more likely path to scale. And this is primarily like in the health and education space. Government is the provider at scale in most places. And so one interesting example of this is the country of Liberia. Recognized the Ministry of Education in Liberia a few years ago recognized that their education system was failing after years of civil war and then Ebola. Their education system just wasn't working for their kids. And so they did something that was pretty revolutionary. The Ministry of Education brought in 8 providers from outside the country, both nonprofits and for-profits, and let them take over a small number of government schools and said, show us if you can do better. Here's the footprint. We can only pay $50 a student a year. Here's the schools. Here's the students. Show us if you can do better. And they ran a randomized control trial alongside with this test to see what the results were. And what came back was that almost all the providers did dramatically better, some of which did twice as good. Right? And so when you can deliver something that is more cost effective than what government is delivering and already spending money on, you're in a great position to be able to influence government to say, hey, let's do more of this. And that's the intention of this experiment, is that they can show that over time they're able to deliver better results and can deliver it for the same cost point. Then it makes a lot of sense for government to expand and adopt these better practices. A third path to scale is replication or franchising. That, scaling impact doesn't necessarily have to mean scaling your organization. A lot of us don't necessarily have the aspiration to create a big, big organization. We just want to serve a particular community, and that's great. But if you're trying to serve a particular community or even a country, if you have a solution, ask yourself the question, is this the best possible thing out there? Is there anyone doing something better? If you have the best thing out there and you don't want to scale, look at how you can help others adopt what you've come up with. Can you get your ideas out there? Microfinance is perhaps the biggest example of success here, where microfinance was started by Grameen Bank and BRAC in Bangladesh, but it's spread around the world where there's hundreds of millions of people who've now been able to benefit from microfinance, but not through any one organization, through thousands of different organizations. And so franchising or replication is another path to scale, or you can call it open sourcing as well. So the final principle of lean impact is to relentlessly seek impact. Again, this may seem obvious, right? Because of course we're mission-driven organizations, we're nonprofits, we're social enterprises. Of course we want to seek impact. Well, I've seen so often that we lose sight of our way as we're trying to do so. One of the issues is that we forget to fall in love with our problem, and instead we fall in love with our solution, right? Have you guys ever seen this happen?
Oh yeah.
And this is I think this is true everywhere, but I think it's particularly true when we're talking about social impact, right? Because we have so much pride of ownership over our solutions because we want to do good. We poured our heart and souls into these things. Oftentimes, we've seen our solution help some people at least. Right? Because usually when you do something, it usually can do some good. But one of the reasons I know this is true is that I work with lots of different nonprofits, a lot of them in the same sector, and every single one of them will tell me their solution is the best. And it just can't possibly be true that everyone's solution is the best. And so we need to ask ourselves the hard question, do we really have the best thing out there, or are we just trying to promote our own solution because we care about it, we feel ownership over it, we're trying to promote ourselves or ensure our organization survives or anything like that. So instead, what I think we should do is focus on the metrics that matter. And this will tell us whether our solution is the best. So too often we focus on these metrics on the left that are what Eric calls vanity metrics because they sound good, but they don't actually mean anything. Now these are things like the number of people we've touched or served, the number of dollars we've raised or deployed. Because this tells you that you did something, but it doesn't actually tell you whether what you did worked. Right? Did those 10,000 people, are their lives better in any way? It doesn't say that. We just said we touched 10,000 people. And even if we did improve the lives of those 10,000 people, it doesn't say whether someone else could have done more with those same resources. So instead, what's more important is that we focus on these metrics on the right, which are what I call the innovation metrics. And these are the unit level metrics on value, growth, and impact that talk about how many, out of every 100 people, how many people, adopted what you provided. What's your conversion rate? What is your unit cost? What is your success rate? You could sum this up as overall cost effectiveness. Because when you can be more cost effective, when you can deliver at a unit level more value, growth, and impact for every person that you reach, that's going to pay dividends over time. And so what we should be focusing on is relentlessly looking at how do we improve on those unit level metrics so that for each person we reach, for each dollar we spend, we are getting the most bang for the buck. So I'll just wind it up by saying, in the corporate world, you never see companies who are saying, hey, we made a little bit of profit, we're happy with that, let's all go home, right? Companies focus on maximizing profits, maximizing shareholder value. They're incredibly competitive and relentless and don't always do good as a result in maximizing their profits. And I would argue that we need to raise the bar in the social sector. That if we're mission driven, we're a nonprofit, we're social enterprises, that we're trying to do good, we can't let ourselves be satisfied with just doing some good. We should be relentless about ensuring that we're maximizing the impact and the scale of whatever we do. And we get there by starting with that big audacious goal, but then testing and optimizing around value, growth, and impact, and staying relentlessly focused on getting to that overall goal that we set. So thank you.
Awesome.
I think we have some time for some questions.
So come line up at the mics, please. There are one on each side of the room for questions.
Questions, anybody? While people are thinking about their questions, I'll just mention I brought a few books. If anybody's interested, I'm selling them for $24 plus tax, and I'm happy to sign them. So come by afterwards. But happy to answer any questions first. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sunga. I am a fellow at Vanity University. It's actually in Oakland. It's a tech thing. So what they do is capacity building. And like you're saying, it's so hard to measure impact, but it's providing courses to countries in the global south. So
Yes, I know Philanthropy University well. Connor is a friend of mine.
Oh yeah, he's my boss. So one thing that we have been trying to do is see if what we're doing is actually working, because we're saying that we provide courses that will help people to make their organization better, but how does that look like? That is the way that we're seeing it. Right now we're at a place where we feel like what we have done so far, we don't have enough data to say, is this actually working? People using it in a way that we think they are, other organizations really changing. So I think my question is, what would be the best practices for us? If we measure the value, then it's how many people come, but that doesn't really show how many people have completed.
Right, it's a great question. Impact is a lot harder to measure than e-commerce transactions, right? E-commerce, you can just say, did they click the buy button? They did click the buy button, then we're good, right? And yeah, I think this is a classic thing that for most organizations, because it's hard to measure impact, we just count. Like how many people took a course, how many people got a training, how many people got a solar panel. We just count, and it doesn't actually tell us whether we help those people. And so I think we need to dig in a lot deeper, and I've talked to Connor some about this with Philanthropy University, but the first thing you need to do is have that theory of change. What is it that you're trying to what do you hope to affect in these people's lives? What do you hope to have be better? And then what's the theory of change, or what are the steps to getting there? And then start testing each of those linkages in the theory of change to see what's happening and how do we get better at it, right? And so the theory of change in Philanthropy University might start with, okay, people need to take the class. So we want to see how many people take the class. Then we need to see how many people finish the class, because if they don't finish the class, they're less likely to get the benefit. So we might want to optimize for that. Then we might optimize for what did they learn from taking the class? Did they apply these skills in some way, right? And then depending on what those skills are, we can have some way to try to determine, are they applying those skills? Are they still applying them over time? And then did they, by applying those skills, lead to whatever impact that we're hoping to see over time, right? So it's really breaking it down to test each of those linkages and look at how do we optimize that. Yeah, I think there's another question here.
Thank you for the session. It was pretty much very insightful. I wanted to ask, when it comes to sustaining impact, Over time, there's a tendency that you make a lot of profits from the services that you're providing, or you get a lot of funding. And there's that tendency to want to reduce the quality of the solution that you're providing, or the products that you're providing. It could also boil down to the quality of staffing that you bring to the table. So how do you balance that quality, like sustaining quality and impact, with the what's it called now, the profitability aspect of it? Yeah. So how do you balance it along the way?
Yeah, it's a great question. How many people here work on like social businesses or social enterprises? Is that about half of you? And then how many work on like nonprofits? Okay, so a little bit more than half are nonprofits. So, for the nonprofits, it's a lot easier to stay focused on impact because that's really what nonprofits are set up to do. For the social enterprises, there is this tension between profits and impact, right? But at the same time, what I've seen in my research is that the most exciting and the most compelling solutions are often coming from this hybrid space, from organizations that are trying to do some of both. Because I think in part because by having the profitable model or the business model, it forces these organizations to really be smarter, and it's a real driver for them to get better and better over time because they have those financial pressures that you don't necessarily have in a nonprofit. But there is that tension, and so I think it's important in just the way that you measure, and probably every week in your senior staff meetings, you're looking at what's our profit, what is our profit, what are our revenues, and so forth. And I would say the first step I would take is add into that your impact metrics. And you're not going to be able to have the impact metrics that take like an RCT to measure over time, but you can have the early signals of the impact metrics that you measure, in a shorter time frame. So like for Harambe that I gave the example earlier, they could be measuring, what's the retention rate? Is the retention rate going up or down? What's the placement rate? Is that going up or down? For the mosquito net example, it can be measuring what's the percentage of people who are hanging up the mosquito nets. Those are the things that we want to make sure get optimized in order to be sure that we're delivering impact over time. So it's really having those metrics front and center in the same way that the profitability metrics are. But it's also, I think, one of the things I write about in the last chapter of the book is we need better structures for these hybrid organizations that are trying to do both profit and purpose. Because the investors will drive you towards the profit side, and it's easy to lose sight of the purpose along the way. And so we need ways to better blend philanthropic and investment money and better set up the entities to be able to balance across both of these, because it is not entirely a zero-sum game, but there is a trade-off between profits and impact oftentimes. Should we go over here?
Hello. So this is such an inspiring presentation that you made. My name is Mei Chang. I'm an FS Core Fellow from India, and I have worked with the Tower Trust Foundation on NextLeaf analytics, and also in Gujarat in India, right? And another similar project by GOC, and it was really I really liked the angle that you presented in a way that we do ask women that how much for the duration of the stroke that has been used, what was the main purpose of the usage and stuff. So, and most of the times that if we run the analytics, that doesn't really match with what the responses are. So during this situation, how do you suggest that how do we do the impact evaluation? And because raising funds or continuation of funds is also important. So what are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on what you're trying to do, right? So there's different phases of measuring impact. A lot of times we go directly to a big I impact evaluation before we do the little I impact evaluation. right? So the big impact evaluation is like doing a randomized control trial that's very expensive and time consuming and so forth. But before we get there, we should test those earlier linkages of the theory of change, right? And you can do things like Nextleaf has sensors that can measure things. But it's really looking at, depending on, and we have to dig into the specific example more, but looking at how do you create the environment where you can see what people's behavior is, right? So in the example of Copia Global that I gave earlier, they didn't set up the whole system to do the real service, but they were able to simulate it with this, somebody hand carrying and delivering the goods and just buying them off the shelf to learn from that, right? So it's looking at what are the ways that we can measure, to actually look at what the behavior of people is rather than asking them what they like or what they did, because looking at behavior is a lot more accurate. I mean, if I asked all of you, like, are you going to go to the gym? I might get a very different answer from, did you, actually see, did you show up at the gym, right? And so a lot of, I think it's just much more accurate when we can see what people actually do, because then that takes into account all the other factors they have to deal with in their lives.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions, and let's see if we can get them all in before half past.
Yes, I have a quick question about impact, and it's regarding from the donor's perspective and the one who, as we as social leaders, we have. And I see a tension specifically when you measure impact. If you provide more money, you want a huge number of people or a huge percentage. But related to the humanitarian sector where I work, it's somewhat people who's living behind in the sector who are unreachable. It's, of course, you need more money to reach to them, and the impact will be less. So what did you find in your research? Very curious to see in what is the trend.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We've gotten so attached to counting numbers in this sector, and I think my number one point in the book is counting numbers is meaningless. And I think that, one of the things we haven't talked very much about is that I think funders drive a lot of this behavior, because funders like to count numbers so that they can say they did something with their money. It's the easiest way for them to quantify it. But it's just meaningless, right? And part of it is meaningless because you don't know if you made an impact. Part of it is meaningless is that not all people are the same, right? That some people are harder to reach, and when you just count numbers, you go after the easiest ones. And so I think it's important for us to really look at, if we're trying to have impact, we need to look at not just the top line numbers, but we need to look at who are we reaching and to what degree are we making a difference in their lives. And the people who are harder to reach are going to be more expensive to reach. But if that's our mission, then we need to educate our donors that reaching these people is more important, but it's also more expensive. It's a longer conversation about how we kind of change the whole donor environment, but it starts with us as organizations really looking at the right metrics and saying, not just saying top line we reached 10,000 people, but just saying, hey, we reached 9,000 of these kind of people, but we reached 1,000 of these other people that are really hard to reach and haven't been touched by other services, right? Like, we have to break those things out.
Hi, my name is Alisa. I'm serving at Eurasia Foundation. It's a 25-year-old, I think, established organization. So my main question is, how do you change established organizations? The approach that you're presenting, I think, is fascinating and can be very successful when you start something new. But what do you do as an organization that is dependent on donors and fiscal year cycles and all the reporting that you need to do to donors? How can you become more flexible?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll give you a couple examples. So one is that just like with an innovation, we need to start small, right? You're not going to transform a large established organization overnight, but if you think about the kind of MVPs I'm talking about, they are really cheap, right? They can be as simple as, instead of just coming up with our solution, sitting in a meeting room, putting out 2 different flyers and see which one people are more compelled by, right? These kind of experiments don't have to be expensive, so a lot of times we let perfect be the enemy of the good. Like we have to do everything this way or we're not going to do anything. It's like take those smaller steps to start introducing experiments that will help you improve on what you're doing today. When it comes to working with donors, one of the things that I've really been promoting is the idea of building in an innovation window. So a lot of donors do have a set RFP that they say we want X kids educated or agriculture or health or whatever. But what if we say 95% of our proposal is going to be, we're going to do exactly what the donor said. We're going to carve out 5% to figure out how to do it better. And we can make a really good case that we believe that 5% will make the other 95% more than 10% better and it'll more than pay for itself. But even if we completely fail, you'll still get 95% of what you want. And so I think looking at ways like that to take smaller steps, innovation isn't expensive. If it's expensive, we're doing it wrong. It really should be cheap and quick so that we're learning as fast as we can. And it's really just starting to build those muscles into the system. The second thing I would say is when organizations talk about how to change, a lot of times what I see organizations do is say, we want to be more innovative. So the CEO gets up and says, let's all be more innovative. And everyone goes back to their desk and they keep doing what they were doing, right? The first step if you want to be more innovative as an organization is you need to set a goal that you can't achieve with business as usual. What I used to do is challenge my teams to say whatever they were doing now that was great and they were super successful, how do we do 10x? Right? Because if you say, how do you do 50%, 20% more, you can just work a little harder, kind of optimize a little bit. But if you say, how do you do 10x? Whatever your thing is, how do you do 10x? You have to then think outside the box. You have to take some risks. You have to try to, push yourselves to do a lot more, and you have to essentially innovate. And so setting at least one goal for your organization that you can't get to with business as usual, that is something like the 10x equivalent, that you continue to track as this is what we're going to need if we really want to fulfill our mission over time, that's the starting point. So I think last question.
Hello, my name is Barbara and I'm serving as a monitoring and evaluation professional. I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about the planning phase being so elongated that the solution that you come up with often at times doesn't hold relevant. I'm just going to go a step further, and I feel there's another issue which is just as important, if not more, is what to do with the evaluation findings once you have them. Because you have the project which is about to end, you have a team which has to take care of the operation and the logistical concerns. So you may not have the time or the resources to actually apply the learning which has taken you so much time to gather resources and data. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, well usually both the theory of change and the evaluation findings all sit on the bookshelf. I call it the encyclopedia, I don't call it evaluation, I call it like encyclopedia production, right? Because you're just creating things that you put on the bookshelf, you hope somebody's gonna take it down someday and look at it, right? I don't think evaluation in the traditional sense or monitoring in the traditional sense is at all useful for learning. Like monitoring is just like, are you stealing money? Are you doing what you said you're going to do? Is this a compliance thing? And evaluation is this sort of after the fact, like producing encyclopedias thing. What we want to do if we want to learn is something different than the two of those. It's something in between. It's the kind of innovation metrics I'm talking about here, these unit level metrics and running experiments like these MVPs that optimize on them. And so we have to be clear on what tool we're using for what job. If what you're doing is trying to write an academic paper that goes on the bookshelf, then an evaluation is a really good thing to generate generalized knowledge. But if you're trying to do is improve on what you're doing, that needs to be something that's built into the program all along the way. And the results that you have, you need to know what you're going to do with those results before you even try to get those results.
Awesome.
So, thank you all for all the great questions and for all your attention. Like I said, I have some books there. If someone would like to buy a book and have it signed, stop by. And thanks again for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for your time. That was fascinating. Thanks for all the questions.